Happy Halloween, Katelyn.
Happy All Hallows Eve, Roxy. It's the church answer.
That is the church answer.
How annoying.
All right. Don't think, just answer. Candy bars or gummy candies?
Candy bars.
Spooky decorations on your front porch or harvest themed?
If there are children around, I'm going harvest themed. If it's like an adult Halloween party, I'm going spooky.
Good answer. Are you a witch or a vampire?
Well, according to some of my haters on Twitter, I'm probably a witch.
What is the tweet that you just read to me that someone literally tweeted to you?
The top line is that I was called a promiscuous bimbo. And this person named Fran promised me that hell, quote, hell eagerly awaits your final breath, Katelyn.
That is spooky.
That sounds pretty witchy to me. From Religion News Service, this is Saved by the City, a podcast from two Christian women coming at you from New York and the middle of nowhere. I'm Katelyn Beatty, casting spells and drinking the blood of youth, as you do.
And I'm Roxy Stone.
I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. This week on The State of Belief, a roundup of bus tours in support of religious freedom and democracy in this election season, including Interfaith Alliance's own The Vote is Sacred bus tour.
We're taking this phrase from the late, great Congressman John Lewis and really trying to show how diverse religious communities are all getting out the vote and are engaged in democracy.
The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Distributed by Religion News Service Podcasts and available on your favorite podcast app.
Katelyn, you are like literally driving across the country right now in the middle of nowhere as this podcast airs.
Yes, my future self is listening to my contemporary self, my current self record this. And I'm driving across the country in a car.
Okay, what's on your playlist? Favorite road trip songs?
I appreciate like 70s dad rock, also related to the adjacent category of yacht rock. They are distinct but overlapping. But anything that you can belt too. What about a road trip snack?
Oh, I love road trip snacks. I'm going to get sunflower seeds. I'm going to get beef jerky. I'm probably going to get some like sour gummy worms or something. What about you? What are you getting at the gas station?
It's been a while since I've eaten these, but when I think of a road trip, I think of combos.
Yes, right. Do you get like the pizza flavored ones or the nacho flavored ones?
I was thinking of the pizza flavored ones, which is just so gross. But
that is gross. Yeah.
Again, it's been a while.
I'm judging. All right, when you get to your destination, which is Ohio, what is the chain you are most looking forward to going out to dinner?
Oh, that's easy. It's a regional chain called Skyline Chili.
Oh, you like that? Like the chili on the spaghetti?
I take it you do not.
It's baffling to me, and I don't understand it. Spaghetti sauce is very similar to chili, but for some reason, it's the chili powder that makes chili and makes it great for other types of carbs, like Fritos.
Yeah.
Like a Frito pie, that's amazing. But chili over spaghetti?
I don't disagree. It's a very specific taste that if you lived in like Southern Ohio, Kentucky, that Midwest region, you probably grew up on it and you like it, but I understand why it's not appealing to everybody else. Do you like a chili dog? Do you like a chili hot dog?
Of course.
Okay, well, they have really good chili dogs too.
I'm an American.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we will definitely go to Skyline at some point when I'm home. I'm not going to do this before I leave New York, but if someone in my life were like, hey, let's go to the Applebee's in Times Square, I actually think that would be really fun.
I haven't done the Applebee's. I have done the Red Lobster in Times Square a couple times.
You are such a fan of seafood.
I don't know if our producer would qualify Red Lobster's seafood.
Seafood adjacent.
Our producer from Maine is like dying inside right now.
What's your favorite kind of seafood?
Crustacean. The kind that comes in shells.
Really?
Yeah. So shrimp, lobster,
wait a minute.
oysters, mussels,
Okay, so
clams.
basically non-fish.
You just asked me for my favorite.
Man, that's so interesting.
I take it this is not the case for you.
I think it's the work that is a deterrent.
That's the best part.
Yeah, we are different in this regard, in the most important regard. So
Yeah, there's the activity.
it's the
So
mess
fun.
and then the work for just like a little tiny piece of meat.
I know. So you're arriving in Ohio on Halloween.
Mm-hmm. That's the plan.
I do have some spooky news for you. You are going to have to church shop.
Yeah, church shopping. It's almost like, what is it akin to? Is it akin to dating, buying a new car, buying a new house?
Yeah, it's a little bit. I mean, I feel like it's most akin to dating. It's definitely not fun.
Yeah. Why is it not fun?
Well, I don't love the small talk, as we've discussed.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to. I feel like there's just a lot of pressure to meet people and have conversations afterwards.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like reading between the lines about a lot of things to try to figure out figure out church values.
I think it's having to show up in a space consistently where you don't know many, if any, people and try to get a feel for it. If you are someone like me who would prefer to just kind of go in and go out and not have to really interact with people,
yes,
it could be fine. But it seems like interacting with people is a core way that you figure out whether you want to be at that church or not.
Unfortunately.
And something random, like something out of the ordinary at that church could make your particular experience of it on a particular Sunday bad. Like, what if they have a guest preacher who's just off in their own world?
Well, to help you out in this rather spooky endeavor, I've prepared a few scenarios for you, like church scenarios. So you tell me, red, yellow, or green.
Okay.
As in, red light, do not go to this church. Yellow light, proceed with caution. Or green light, go forth in peace.
This is akin to like red, yellow, and green flags in dating.
Yes, well, sure. I could have gone with flags. I was going with lights because of the road trip theme.
Right.
All right, here we go. Coffee hour after church includes some icebreaker games.
That is insane, and I am out of there so fast. Are you kidding me? That's like the two worst things you can think of combined into one setting.
Yeah.
I never like being cajoled into forced social interaction. That's a red flag.
Red light. Okay.
Wow, we're going to have to workshop this later in a Google Doc.
Okay. What if there's a Starbucks in the church lobby?
I'm going to say it's a yellow flag.
Mm-hmm.
I'm instinctively very against having a corporate entity inside a household of God. At the same time, I'm not against having, B-, like decent coffee available.
But you would prefer it was like an independent coffee shop.
Yeah, that would be better.
What if the church owned the coffee shop? That would be better.
And it was called Uncommon Grounds.
It's really clever. I will say that a coffee shop in the church lobby definitely signals evangelical, non-denominational.
It's giving evangelical.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not the coffee itself. Like most churches you're gonna find coffee on Sunday mornings. It's something about the coffee shop. You can so clearly hear the person that's like, I know, people love coffee shops. Let's put the coffee shop in the church.
It'll be a third space.
Yes. Evangelicals in their third spaces.
They forgot that the church is supposed to be the third space.
Oh.
All right, shifting vibes. The church music features only an organ.
I'm going to say yellow flag. Like, I have been really privileged to go to a church the last several years with an incredible music program with professional musicians and singers every Sunday. So it would be a hard pivot to just go from that to just an organist. But I also like a lot of old hymns. Like, I'm not against a more, traditional approach. So yellow flag.
Yellow flag. All right. The pastor uses 7 sports analogies in their sermon.
Oh, that's a red flag, 100%. for so many reasons. They're like, I could list 7 reasons.
7 reasons.
It's just gendered in a way that can be off-putting. I mean, you know, in a stereotypical way, right? But if a woman were preaching, which I don't know how much it happens in these spaces, but if a woman were preaching and she just kept referring to something traditionally feminine, that would also be alienating to people. Like it's the presumption of like, we all know what a tackle is.
Wow.
Also,
I think most people do know what a tackle is, but but good one.
To this day, I don't. And I guess the other thing is, I don't know, there's kind of this like overreaching attempt to be culturally relevant and just assuming like sports is the lingua franca of our time.
Right.
Wow, that sounded so elitist.
So elitist. You're going to have to tone that down.
Say lingua franca like I'm a normal person, like an American. Anyway, it's something about the go-to, like sports as the go-to for like cultural relevance that I'm like, we have many different ways to make faith culturally relevant.
That's true. You could do birding analogies instead, for example.
My boss has offered this as an aside. Anytime there's a sports analogy, I'm like, I think I followed that. And he's like, would you prefer that we use bird watching metaphors? It's very sweet.
All right, last one. The pews are full of single men. More single men than single women, in fact.
You know, starting out, I'm going to say it's a green flag. It's green until it's not.
Yes, right. Good. It's nice to see, but also like...
It's nice to see, yes.
As the recent New York Times article wrote about, and as our conversation last year about why orthodoxy is drawing young men, that can signal a sort of like weird, like hierarchy, complementarian, gendered, trad kind of situation.
It all depends. I'm starting out green. What I want to know more information on is why are so many presumably younger single men drawn to this church? Like, what is in the water that they're responding to? They could be responding to something good, right?
Right.
Or they could be responding to something concerning, or just something that would indicate this is not a church for me.
All right, but for real, what do you think you'll be looking for in a new church? Well, and a church community.
Yeah.
I think this is hard. A hard question when you think about like a new, like starting over. Church isn't always the first thing necessarily that comes to mind, but I feel like it's also one of the most like consequential decisions.
It's a big component.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say it wasn't until I found the church that I go to now in New York that I felt like, okay, I'm really settled in New York. Like it seems to kind of signify a commitment, a choice. Like these are the people I'm going to practice faith alongside. So it is a big deal. It's really hard for me to imagine not going to a liturgical church. I have been in liturgical churches my whole adult life, and I really like the liturgy and the structure and having communion every week.
Right.
I will say, though, that that's not the only thing. Like, I've visited liturgical churches where there are maybe 20 people there.
Right.
And that can be daunting to think about, okay, is this going to be my church community? Having some sense that there is a gathering of people who are really committed to being there and showing up for each other and have figured out how to take some ownership of their own place at church is important. I think generally you kind of want a sense that the people here aren't just here as consumers, but want to become more engaged, invested in each other's lives in some whatever shape that looks like. And I say that I say that in part as a single person. I think it's important to me to not feel like this is a church that caters to individual families who are primarily here to get like good programming and then leave.
There's this young couple at my husband's church that I was talking to them a couple weeks ago, and they moved into the Upper East Side, which is not the youngest of neighborhoods, and It's an Episcopal church, so not the youngest of church communities.
Right.
And in a lot of, and they kind of came more out of an evangelical background. And they weren't even like looking for an Episcopal church necessarily. They literally chose the church because it was close. Like it was walking distance. And that was important to them, they said. Well, first of all, they said that they would be late every Sunday if they had to get on a subway to get to church. So I think it's important to know yourself.
True. Yes.
But it was like they wanted to invest in the neighborhood where they lived. And they're like leading youth group now. And, they got like involved really quickly. And I was kind of like, well, I was impressed with that because I think that takes some of the question out a little bit. I mean, there's more than one church on in that neighborhood. So I'm not saying they didn't church shop at all, but it's like just sort of saying, this is the thing I want to prioritize is being in a church that I can walk to that's in the neighborhood that I live in.
Yeah.
And I'm putting down roots here. Like that is one way to really like choose a church. And I have not chosen a church that way, but I find something very appealing about that.
Yeah. It's easy for me to knock the idea of someone getting in their car and driving 45 minutes to the church of their choice. And at the same time, I do exactly the same thing every week. I just get on the subway instead of in a car.
Right. What has drawn me to churches when I've made decisions about where to go to church has usually been relationships that I already had, which I think in the end has been an important priority for me. Maybe because it's so hard for me to like do the get to know people thing and the small talk thing, but I feel like I need a welcome that already exists in a church.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What can't you not have at a church? Besides Jesus.
I have to sort out this double negative. What can't I not have at church? I think the thing aspirationally that I'm looking for in church or hoping for in church is a sense of the surrounding community and neighborhood and some kind of I don't want to say outreach because that feels like the wrong thing. Or it feels like a loaded word
We're back at Starbucks.
For evangelicals. Exactly. But some kind of way of like, we exist in this community. And if we were not here, the community would be different and would be hopefully lesser for it if we were not here. Like some kind of church that's making an impact on its neighbors.
Our guest today has spent a lot of time in churches, as in she has been reporting on religion for decades.
Adelle Banks is a national reporter for Religion News Service, and in her new book, Becoming a Future-Ready Church, 8 Shifts to Encourage and Empower the Next Generation of Leaders, Adelle and her co-authors look into what really draws people to church.
The issue of belonging is really key. If people don't feel like they belong, they're not going to come back.
We'll hear more from Adelle about these trends after the break.
But first, Religion News Service is an independent, award-winning source of global reporting on religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics.
From the pews to the polls, RNS covers all the places religion is found.
Come find us on social media. We're at Saved by the City on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube.
We'd also love to hear your feedback and ideas for future guests and topics. So drop us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts or shoot us an email at sbtcpodcast@religionnews.com. We're waiting.
See the new feature documentary film, Blue Baby, October 9th. The documentary follows 8 boys through Father Edward J. Flanagan's Boys Town, a prison alternative in Omaha, Nebraska. Matters Media filmmakers gained unprecedented access to take the audience inside Boys Town to a world that challenges what people have believed about problem behavior for thousands of years. Blue Baby is a film that goes beyond the heart of a Catholic priest and into the real-world impact of what he created. See it October 9th and visit mattersmedia.org to experience this powerful documentary.
Well, it's a particular treat today to be joined by one of my RNS colleagues, the most long-term reporter at Religion News Service, Adelle Banks. Hi, Adelle.
Hi, Adelle. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
And congratulations on the launch of your new book.
Yes.
So you and your co-authors write off the bat that it's likely that a reader's church is using a model of ministry that's stuck in the year 1950, but they're trying to prepare for a culture that's closer to 2050. So what are some of the things that are more akin to 1950 than 2050 besides the bad coffee, which is perennial and timeless?
Thank you both for having me. I'm so pleased to be with you today, and thank you for your interest. I will say that my main task for this book with my co-authors, Daniel Yang, who's a futurist and missiologist, and Warren Bird, who's a church researcher, is to provide stories that represent the shifts that are in our book. But we note that, people might remember or not Leave It to Beaver. And there's that aspect of kind of the old fashioned way of doing things. And that is something we say that the church is sometimes can be accused of, or can be guilty of. And so we're suggesting all kinds of ways to be more ready for the future and more like what it will be in the future by making some changes. There's just the traditional things that people expect, like that the pastor's going to be doing everything and the pastor's going to be the sole teacher. And some of the people that I interviewed have churches where they have examples of the people being very much involved in what they would say is discipling one another, leading even house churches where the pastors are nowhere to be found, but instead the people who are pastoring are actually lay people. So those are some examples. People often think of the usher greeting someone at the front of a church, and everybody else in the church just sits down and doesn't ever shake anybody's hand or do anything to make them feel welcome. Even signage, just letting people know where the bathroom is and that kind of thing so that you feel comfortable when you walk in. Those are all things that we think that the churches need to think about. Just, some of the real specific ways that people relate to one another, but even just the look of the space where people worship.
That's interesting, because I think when people hear become future ready, or thinking about becoming relevant for today's generation or whatever, however you want to phrase it, I think most people go to technology. They think, oh, we have to get the latest tech, or we need to have the coolest worship music. But it sounds like from what you just described, it's maybe more about creating community or more about reaching people than it is necessarily about keeping up to date with all the coolest new things.
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about the digital aspect in a bit. But yes, the issue of belonging is really key. If people don't feel like they belong, they're not going to come back.
Yeah, and even thinking about a previous ministry model where the pastor or the leaders are kind of in charge and doing all the work of church, it was striking to find just a very consistent theme in the trends that you're charting, is that people actually want to feel it matters if they're there or not on Sunday morning, that people know them, that there's a space of belonging where they're actually participants rather than just consumers.
Yes, one of the churches I talked about people being contributors instead of consumers. And they didn't have to necessarily use the word membership anymore. And in fact, several of the people I interviewed have moved away from that term. They focus more on people feeling a sense of attachment rather than worrying about specifically attendance or membership. So yes, it's a different viewpoint.
You report that millennials now form the largest demographic of weekly and monthly church attendees. So take that. We did come back to church after all, despite all the dire warnings. So millennials now outpace Gen Z. Obviously, they're in the dip of church attendance in their early 20s, but also Gen X and Boomer attendees. So in your findings, what are millennials responding to that isn't the same as maybe previous generations?
Millennials are, in their late 20s to early 40s for the most part, and they make up the majority of the adult population right now. And one thing is that they may be just settling down and wanting to have a spiritual space where they can raise their families. And my co-author, Daniel Yang, told me this cool term, baby boomerang, that some people are coming back, to church attendance because they have more than just themselves, perhaps their whole family that they want to raise in a faith. And the findings also may reflect the increase of non-denominational churches and the increase in attendance there, and the greater likelihood that millennials are less tied to a tradition or a denomination. They also might be looking for that community, that same word we were using before, that the church can provide, and they might be involved in a certain cause that the church is involved in. It might be helping the community, such as feeding the homeless or the hungry, and sometimes that might appeal to them more than sitting in service, but doing some of the faith in action that some churches provide.
Let's talk about the nuclear family, which seems to be a recurring theme that we touch on the podcast. You offer this alternative of forged family. What does that look like in a local church?
A forged family refers to the long-term relationships that can develop amongst people who have a common experience. Sometimes it could be suffering or shared trauma, but there's something that brings them together. The co-authors and I suggest that church leaders need to consider the fact that the families don't look like they used to in many, many cases. And since the 1960s, there's been this distinct drop in the families that are a married couple with children and an increase in single people and single parents with children. Mm-hmm. I interviewed a Reverend Carl Johnson at Faith City Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, and his congregation intentionally includes single moms, single dads, multiracial families. And in fact, when I interviewed him, because I did my interviews over Zoom, he was wearing a black t-shirt with white letters that said in all caps, family member, because that was his church's emphasis, is that everybody, no matter who you are, is a family member. And there's different ways his church emphasizes that. For instance, when they worship together, the parents are invited at the end of the service to stay put for a little bit while their children are in a separate area. They're supposed to be able to relax for a change. And as Reverend Johnson told me, they can have a conversation for 10 or 20 minutes with an adult, which they may not have much of the time during the rest of the week. So there's just an emphasis and understanding of that. And a whole nother topic, which is interesting that this church does that relates to families, is they have a grocery store in the same space that they worship in. And they've seen the dynamic of being able to help families who needed discounted groceries and that kind of thing. And one of the things he said that was most heartwarming was, again, related to the families. That there might be a single mom with a child who wants to reach and get something off the shelf, and the mother doesn't have to say they have to put it back because the prices were reasonable and they were able to not only fill stomachs, but also restore dignity for people.
One of the things that you explore in the book and found in the research and the reporting is that a lot of people are not necessarily resistant to faith because of intellectual barriers, which I think is what traditionally we're like, oh, people who believe in science don't believe in God or whatever. Like we've heard that forever, but that it really today is more about pain points and people's experiences, maybe with being disappointed in the church or hurt by the church. So they're not really asking as much, how do I reconcile the Bible and say evolution, but rather, is God good? Can I trust the people in this church? How did you find that mind to soul shift affects churches' outreach and affects how churches need to be talking to people who they're hoping to attract to their church?
One of the best examples I think of that was Coastal Church, which was a church whose leaders I interviewed, and they're in Vancouver. And interestingly, the example relates to something that's been around for a while, but they're using it in ways that reach people now. And that's the Alpha Course, which you probably have heard of. It's like a 10-week evangelistic course. But they are finding that those millennials we were talking about, people in their 30s primarily were attending their Alpha Course, and it was a chance to learn about the basics of Christianity. But their goal is multiple. One is that there's a huge issue of loneliness, particularly in their community. They knew that was a felt need. And this brings people together for 10 weeks in a group, and they get to be with other people and perhaps go have coffee afterwards or whatever. But there's also this issue of having a non-threatening, safe space to bring up these questions that they might have about Christianity. And one of the things that Cheryl Coop, one of the key pastors there, said is that they teach their leaders of these Alpha courses to be accepting of anything someone says. They don't say, oh, no, you're wrong, that's not in the Bible. They say, oh, that's interesting. And they pass the ball so that people can talk about it and just be open to whatever. And so that's part of it, that people are still strong in their faith, but they don't reject something someone says when they're just trying to learn about the faith. So that's one of the things that they talked about.
In one of the later chapters of the book, the Gen Z and maybe younger millennial interest in thinking of safe spaces as also being spiritual spaces with particular regard for kind of mental health or like holistic personal health. And I thought that was interesting, that the sense of safety that someone could have in a church or a religious community could really make or break their connection to that community. You know, safety is forged when someone can kind of say whatever they want and not be shunned or shut down or, you know, dismissed. I thought that was an interesting takeaway.
Yeah, my co-author, Daniel Yang, actually created a model that relates to this very topic of these different kinds of spaces. And it's first related to something that has 4 V's in it. It's like having visibility, so knowing that you feel represented and seen, and having a voice where you can talk openly, and feeling valued, so that even if you're vulnerable, you know that there's some accountability in the community. And then the last one is volition, where you are able to exercise the choices you want to make and have a chance to affect those who are in power in making their decisions. But then he leads all of that to different kinds of spaces of ways to people can meet, people can talk to another and one another and be authentic. So one is yard spaces where there can be dialogue about like theological or social issues, maybe like a seminar or a webinar where they can speak freely in a safe space. And then there's porch spaces where classes or cohorts may look into the theology or philosophy on which the church is based, and the leaders can find out how to be more accessible to the community through that kind of space. And then there's couch spaces, which are smaller groups, which people are probably more familiar with, where they might share personal experiences or help recover from trauma or engage in some kind of spiritual discovery. And the last one is table spaces, which is almost like an advisory council where, they literally have a seat at the table because that helps them feel welcome and it helps them maybe stay put in a congregation where they have some concerns but need to be able to voice them. So it's important for churches to not just think of like one space as to the place for people to meet, but just be open to different ways where people can have their concerns met so that they don't leave.
Did you see differences across race as you were working on this book and on your reporting? Were Black churches or Latino churches wrestling with these questions in different ways than majority white churches were, or struggling with sort of different questions about their future?
That's a good question. There were a couple of people amongst the ministers I interviewed who are Black ministers, and some of them are dealing with the same declines in membership and attendance as others, and also the challenge of getting people to move back from the couch for the height of COVID to, back into the building. But there have been some studies that have found that regular church attendance, if it is increasing, it's often increasing among non-white millennials. I spoke to a minister just this week for RNS about a story I'm working on, and he told me that almost the majority of people in his church who join now are Gen Z and millennials, which is not what some people might think, but that is the case in his particular instance. Another example from the book is a minister named Charles Galbraith, who has a church called Alliance Tabernacle, and that's in Brooklyn. And that community he's in is like about 92% African American, and this is an African American man, but he nevertheless thought it was important to reach people who were not Black in the community. And so it ended up that church started a sort of separate location that met the needs of younger people, met the needs of Latinos, as well as some Caribbean people and some white people. And this was in like a neighborhood that had art spaces and galleries, and they met in a more informal way. So he also is discovering that there are ways that even if you have a majority Black church, there's ways to reach people who are not Black.
So this book is really helpful in laying out a specific rubric for church leaders to kind of examine their own assumptions and practices and start to pivot one step at a time toward this, future preparedness. As I was reading the book, I was also wondering, are there specific things that churches not just need to change programmatically, but actually repent of, where they have done their neighbors wrong or have harmed them in some way?
Well, I don't know whether the word repent is necessarily the word I would use, but I would say that there's a definite need for churches to kind of let go of what they're used to doing, which can harm people in a variety of different ways or just not attract people. So, for instance, there's this issue of the pastor being the sole leader, as I mentioned, and just having someone listen to your sermon and go home instead of having something more interactive. And one of my favorite examples is actually a church where people aren't needing to be worried about going home because it's a digital church almost completely. It's called Imagine Church, and it's led by Pastors Janae and Justin Klatt. And they meet online in small groups. And these are people who meet across the country on a particular day of the week, and they worship together. But when they worship together, they listen to the sermon, and there's a pause in the sermon for them to have a conversation because they are trying to interpret the scripture that they're reading that week to their own situation. And for example, when they started it, they had members who were in California who were dealing with the wildfires, and they paused and talked about how they were going to care for their community under those circumstances. And one of the ministers, Justin Platt, was like, wow, this is church, because they're really helping the people. And that, I think, has been one of the issues that maybe churches need to repent of, is not just worrying about preaching to the people, but helping the people and in what ways they can do it. And another part of that is that people might think, oh, it's a digital church, they're not going to be able to do anything besides meet once a week. Well, they communicate with each other via a special chat channel on an app and let people know their prayer requests. And even when they had a member who lost his wife, who passed away, they had an online memorial service. But not only that, they decided to collect money and got an Uber Eats card for the family. And one of the people in that particular group was a flight attendant and arranged a layover so that she could drop the card off in person to the person who was going through this loss. So that's just an example of really thinking outside the box sometimes and realizing there are different ways of being church. And what maybe people need to repent of is just having one kind of church.
Yeah, I was really struck by that example in the book, in the section about kind of blended virtual and in-person model. I think I'm dubious of the ability for technological platforms to forge the kind of family feeling and sense of belonging that in-person community can. And at the same time, I think the stories that you reported on in the book were a reminder that for specific people, that virtual church meeting once a week may be their lifeline to other people. And that's not to be denigrated. Like, the goal is not necessarily to get those people into the real church, which is the in-person church.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that struck me about this Imagine Church is that some of their members have serious health issues like MS.
Right.
And the people only leave their houses when they go to like a doctor's appointment. And so, yes, in fact, it really is a lifeline for them. And the pastors I interviewed, said it's really hard not to be in a church where you're not hugging people, because that's what they were used to doing before in the brick and mortar setting. But yes, there are definitely some needs to be met for those who never darken a door of a church.
Mm-hmm. You and your co-author say ultimately this is a book about hope. And I could see that because you're really giving churches some agency in how they prepare for the future. It's not all doom and gloom. But what makes you personally hopeful as you think about the church as it heads to year 2050?
Well, I'm hopeful because I talk to these different clergy and leaders of these churches who are doing things differently than you might think. And it's kind of like what Justin Platt said about Imagine Church. It's like, this is church. Like, people think church is one thing, but it could be something completely different. Like, for instance, I interviewed Susie Gamas, who has a church in Sacramento, Midtown Church. And I've certainly heard of people helping the homeless in different ways, but she told me that her church partners with other churches and does laundry for people who are homeless and then returns it back to them, which, who would have thought of that? Just things like that are different ways of helping people. And also, I talked to Jason Shepard, who leads the church project in the Woodlands, Texas, and he talked about the firemen and the doctors and the teachers who are pastoring people in his congregation, so to speak, through their house churches. They may meet in a large setting if they so choose, but they also have house churches, which is where all of the kind of nitty-gritty church work happens. So that kind of gives me hope that there are all these different ways of doing church that people may not think of and that may appeal to people who are turned off by the traditional look of church. So that's part of what gives me hope.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was fun to talk to you. And, I think we talk on here a good amount about why people leave church or deconstruction or all of that. So it's kind of refreshing to think about the future of church. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again for having me.
Saved by the City is a religion news service production. Senior producer is Jay Woodward, and the consulting editor is Paul O'Donnell. Our editor is Julia Wyndham.
Chaz Rousseau put together our look, and Martin Fowler wrote our theme music.
We are Roxy Stone.
And Caitlin Beatty. Thanks for listening.